The broadcast is now starting and all attendees are in listen-only mode. For your information, the session will be recorded and the recording may be made available to others. The participants list is private so that other participants cannot see your name. The chat function is in private mode as well. Only the speakers and the moderator receive the chat messages. Please log out if you do not wish to continue based on the above. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to our mindsON RBQM workshop. That's an initiative by Syntegrity's My RBQM Academy. And I'm Tamara, the operations manager of the Academy. So today we present a special edition, and I'm sure you've already heard that the ICH E6R3 draft was released for public consultation, right? And this is our topic today. So let's go through the draft and discuss what it means for RBQM. Our speakers today, that's Keith Doricott. He is heading his independent consulting company, Doricott Metrics and Process Improvement, with a solid background in Lean Six Sigma, business process improvement, and root cause analysis. He assists the Metrics Champion Consortium, among other activities. Keith holds a bachelor's degree in physics. Dr. Johann Pröwe. Besides being a much sought after industry speaker, Johann brings data driven realism to the table, ensuring that clinical trial risk management goals are implementable in the real world. Johann has a considerable depth of experience in clinical research, which has been invaluable to many. So, this will be an interactive workshop of approximately 60 minutes. And that means later in the session, I will unlock the toolbar for you, which you see over here to the right. And in this toolbar, you can see an icon with a mug and pens. Just click on that, please, and click on the T to open a text box. Click anywhere on your whiteboard and start writing. So click OK to send your text, and it will appear directly on our whiteboard in this session here. And don't worry, please, your entries are anonymous. We do not see who sends which entry, so please don't be shy and brainstorm with us later when it is time. And in case that you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat window, which you also find on the right side. Just remember, please, that you send your message only to moderators. If you could select that option, please. Great. Okay, that was an introduction from my side. And I would say now it's time to start with our workshop. So, Johann, please, let's go.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you for the introduction. And well, welcome everybody to this webinar on the ICH E6R3 changes, at least those that have been put out there in draft version. And what Keith and I will be focusing on is the ICH E6R3 and in the context of risk-based quality management. So for those of you that may not have had the chance to take a closer look at the various documents that are available out there, you find some literature here, which is on one hand the draft guideline and the explanatory video on the ICH side. So this is the first citation here. What also might be quite interesting, and Keith dug that out, is the MHRA resource or documentation related to ICH E6R3, because there are a couple of specifics in that document that might be really of interest. And thirdly, there is a Syntegrity article that you can also find here. Actually, what is really important to keep in mind, don't change your processes yet, because this is a guideline that is still in draft. And as we all know, it's probably going to take quite some time until it will go in production. Keith and I, however, decided that we wanted to share with you a couple of things that we saw were changes, between the version E2, the version R2 and R3, and help you in thinking through what the new guideline may hold for you, and maybe where you also feel you may want to comment upon this draft version, because the draft version is a draft one that is out there for public consultation. Just to take a brief look back at ICH E6, it started around 2016 with the release number 2. There was an addendum to the E6 R1 about quality management introduced, and the QTLs, our favorite topic, quality tolerance limits. So just keep that in mind. That happened around 2016. And then there was the release of the various concept papers by FDA and EMA. Then, there were the various principles released in 2021. And then around a couple of months ago, actually, the release of the version 3 with an annex and now ready for consultation. And this is where we currently are. And I think what you see here for 2024, this is probably the best guesstimate that in about a year from now, the E6 R3 may be ready to be adopted. So you still have about a year to think about what needs to be changed in your organization with respect to ICH E6. So you are probably aware that we like polls, and this is the very first one. And Tamara, I hand it briefly over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm opening the poll here on your screen. So the question is, which of the following applies to you in relation to the recent ICH E6R3 draft guidance? And you can select more than just one answer. Thank you. The answers are coming in pretty quick. That's great. We are at 51 now. Just give you another couple seconds to think about it. Which of the following applies to you in relation to the recent ICH E6R3 draft? $53, $54. Okay, that's good. Thank you all very much. I am presenting the answers now, and here we go.
Okay, I suspect that you can now see the responses. And what you see is that the majority of the audience is aware of the draft guidance document. That's already quite good. It's definitely much better than having a group of people that are not aware of it. The second most common response is, I plan to read the draft, which is, I think, also quite good. I'm quite impressed, I must admit, by the 21% of colleagues here on the call that already read the draft version. So that's really good. And I think D, the response D, is also quite interesting. My organization is considering changes in the RBQM due to the draft. That is maybe something, Keith, that we want to discuss. There are a couple of brave people. This is sort of the orange one, the response E. I have, or my organization has made changes in RBQM due to the draft. And the last one is F. I do not, or my organization does not plan to make changes in RBQM due to the draft. So I think that's quite interesting. I'm a little concerned, I must admit, that organizations already started modifying their processes based on a draft guidance document. Keith, is there anything that you may want to add to that?
Well, I think that's a good summary. I mean, I suppose what I would say is those people are planning to read it and haven't read it yet. what we, of course, are giving today is our sort of perspective on the RBQM piece. But there's nothing better than actually reading the document. So, and I know it's one of those things you can plan to do and then never quite get around to do it. But it is, honestly, it is worth it. And certainly the quality management section is pretty short. So
yeah,
well worth a look, even if it's just a draft.
Yeah, absolutely true. No, thank you, Keith. That's very helpful. And let's take a look at the next. So basic question is, why is there an update? And many of us are certainly aware of that there are new trial designs that surfaced in particular due to COVID. Maybe it started already prior to COVID, but are now becoming more and more popular these days. I'm mainly talking about decentralized clinical trials, for instance. Then there are technological innovations. More and more data are being captured based on mobile devices or on wearables, and therefore this also needs to be taken into account. There is an advanced concept of a proportionate risk-based approach that is something that is being explained in the document, and we'll also take a closer look at that. And I think one of the most important aspects is that there should be, or they try to have an alignment with E8 or one on critical to quality factors, a term that surfaced in E8, but had not been mentioned in E6. And people started wondering, what is the connection between E8 and E6? What are quality tolerance limits? How do they play together with critical to quality factors? And I think therefore it was good to have at least the attempt to come to grips with unique definitions, and therefore E6 had to be updated as well. Okay, a couple of things from the principle sections. There's this emphasis on the quality by design. And you can see that here. I hope you can read it, or I'll read it to you. Quality by design should be implemented to identify the factors, so for instance, data and processes that are critical to ensuring trial quality, and the risks that threaten the integrity of those factors and ultimately the reliability of the clinical trial results. So actually, the quality by design is an aspect that I think had been missed for quite some time during, for instance, the protocol development, for instance, during the development of the data capture systems, that it was more about, let's create a protocol and a case report form and let's capture the data, rather than thinking on, what is important, what are the important data. And I'm pretty sure that all of you are aware of those protocols that exceed the 150 pages, and more and more subgroups of patients are being added, because it seems like this is your once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get hold of those patients, capture certain data, and then you'll see afterwards how you're going to use those data. So therefore, I think ICH brought to the table the critical to quality factors and the alignment of those with the critical data and the critical processes. Then a second aspect in section number 7, which is a new section, the risk-adapted approaches. And in particular, that is what Keith and I noticed, is this number 7.3, risks to critical to quality factors should be managed prospectively and adjusted when new or unanticipated issues arise once the trial has begun. So the critical to quality factors should be managed and kept under review. And I think this is something that Keith and I mentioned in a couple of webinars, that a review of the risks, for instance, should take place on a more or less ongoing basis, or at least regularly, because things in a study may change, and a sponsor company as well as a CRO may want to be on top of what's happening in a study, just ensuring that the really important data and the processes are definitely under control. So I think this is the section that refers to this particular issue or approach. And with that, Keith, I pass it on to you for the next couple of slides.
Thank you, Johann. Well, as you've already said, for those of you that attend these regularly, you know we like to use the polling feature. So we're just going to do a quick word search. Well, to get you to guess, if you haven't already checked, to get you to guess on the number of a few words in the draft guidance. So the first one is risk. How many times do you think risk is mentioned in the draft guidance?
Yes, thank you. Just a moment, please. And here we start the poll. How often do you think that the word risk is mentioned? Wow, interesting. We are just presenting it to you in a few seconds. 50 answers collected so far. Anyone else who would like to vote here? 51, thank you. Yeah, and we stop with 55. Just a moment. I'm presenting to you the results now. Okay.
Thank you. So a lot, I guess, is would be the summary of that. People think risk is in it a lot. It certainly is. So F is actually the correct answer, which is the one that has got the highest number of responses. So there's actually 74 mentions of risk in the draft guidance. And just if that on its own, you think, well, yeah, so what? But actually in E6R2, there are 37. So we've actually got literally a doubling of references to risk. So that gives you an idea of one of the significant changes here. So let's go to the next poll, which is the word quality. How many times do you think the word quality is in the draft guidance? Yeah, I think people have got the idea. We can probably end it there, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Here are the results.
Yeah, so very similar, and you're quite right. Yeah, again, F is the correct answer. So there's rather than 74 for risk, quality just trumps it at 78. But in E6R2 for quality, there were 43. So so we're really seeing an emphasis on risk and quality. And the last one we've got for you, just a bit of fun. The last one, what about quality tolerance limit? How many times? Great. Thank you. Let's end it there. And now that is interesting. So that is interesting because we've got half or so saying it's not in there at all, and those are correct. So A is correct, but I'm really intrigued that we've got actually people selecting B all the way through to F. So thinking there's a lot of quality tolerance limit mentions in the draft guide. So there aren't. So in the current E6R2, I think there are 2 mentions, 2 or 3. I think 2, and now there are 0. So it really has changed, and we'll show you that. So that is, I think, quite an important change that we will need to think through, because, again, as many of you, if you've attended our sessions, but also out in the industry and conferences and so on. I mean, QTLs have just been debated and debated and debated. So to not have them in the draft is really quite interesting.
I think, Keith, that result was in line with the ones that read the guidelines already, the draft version, and therefore knew that there is no QTL mentioning.
Yeah, you could well be right. And don't worry, I didn't sit there and count them all. That's the wonderful thing, isn't it, these days with technology? just do a search. So I'm going to go and we're going to take a look at section 3.10. So 3.10 in the draft. So unlike with E6R2, E6R2 was an addendum. So you had the original, which was what, 1996, I think it came out, the first version of E6. When the addendum came out in 2016, 20 years later, it was an addendum. So you could actually see the new pieces that have been added. But now we've got something which is completely modified. Well, it's a new, as it were. So there's not a direct comparison, except if you get yourself the text from R2 and the text from R3, the draft, and compare them. So that's what we've done. And it's quite interesting to do that. And actually, the blog post from the MHRA, that one from Andy Fisher that we referenced, that Johann referenced earlier, that's exactly what he's done. So he's gone through and compared, because he's not just focused on RBQM. RBQM is also sort of a tiny bit of it, really. But he's looked at the whole thing. And so it's really worth looking at, but it's a very long post because there are quite a few differences. But we're just focusing on the RBQM piece. And the main part of that is section 5.0 in E6R2, but it's section 3.10 in E6R3, the draft. And it's really, a lot of it is cut and paste. So I would say there's not huge changes, but some of the changes are certainly worth trying to understand, albeit they're still in draft form. So, but there are some interesting changes, let's put it that way, which we're going to look at. But one of them, which is immediately noticeable, is that the section on critical process and data identification is removed. And Johann showed you that back in the principles section. No, it's not in section 7. It's actually in the preamble to the principles. So before it starts the numbered principles, there's that section, and we showed the image of it, that they refer to critical to quality factors, and then they put in brackets data and processes, or critical data and processes, I think. And so what you then see in section 3.10 is this piece around critical process data, which really has been subsumed now by critical to quality factors. That's now in the preamble piece. So the sort of the introduction to section 3.10 now includes a section around critical to quality factors, and it refers back, in fact, to E8R1, which has a section in it, as you'll know, on how to identify critical to quality factors. So that's how they link up now. So although it's this particular piece is removed from E6R3, the draft, it is I think it's still sort of there because it's in that preamble piece, that introduction piece. So it looks like a significant change, but I'm not sure it's that significant. Let's put it that way. As has already been said, there's an improved alignment with E8R1, and that's certainly the case with for RBQM. We've got these, as already been mentioned, this critical to quality factors are determined rather than critical data, critical process. You identify risks to those critical to quality factors. So you remember in E6R2, you identify risks to the critical data, critical processes. Here, you identify the critical quality factors, and then you identify risks to those. So not very different, really. But it does say risks that have a meaningful impact, which is an interesting addition. So they're not saying any old risk, they're saying risks that have a meaningful impact. And certainly when I've seen teams doing this sort of thing, they do focus on things that have a meaningful impact generally. So it's probably not a great change to the way people actually do it at the moment. There was a piece I think often confused people in E6R2 that says that the risks should be determined at the system level as well as the trial level. And I think people never quite knew how to take that, because everything else is trial level, and suddenly there's this system level piece in there. And maybe that's why they've removed that reference to system level risk. And in a completely separate section, 4.1.3 in E6R3 draft, it says that blinding should always be considered in the risk assessment. So that is new. I don't think, I mean, Johann and I have talked about it. We don't think that's unreasonable at all. In the FDA RBM Q&A document that was finalized earlier this year, that also says that. So it's in alignment with that document. So I think overall sort of better alignment, certainly with the 8R1. So next, let's take a look at the risk evaluation piece. So, you know, we've got our critical quality factors. We've identified risks in those, all fine and good so far, I think. There's some, on the face of it, what seem some rather odd changes here. And I just don't know why. I can't see why they would have made the changes that they have. And so there may be someone out there that has a bit more information as to where these have come from, because all we can do really is sort of compare the new text versus the current text. So in this risk evaluation piece, there's a number of changes. So it no longer states to evaluate against the existing risk controls, which sort of seems odd to me, because if you take, I don't know, the informed consent process, it can go wrong in many ways. But generally, we have very good processes for informed consent. And so it shouldn't go wrong very often. There may be reasons in a particular study why informed consent is more challenging, more risky. But typically, you would think, well, I'm going to just evaluate against existing controls, and I've got, you know, people are trained, I've got SOPs, I've got people qualified, so on and so on and so on. So why wouldn't I evaluate against those existing controls? So I can only think that it's sort of they're thinking, well, this is just assumed. I mean, it would make no sense to me to evaluate against anything else. But it just seems an odd thing to have removed. I can't see why you'd remove it. They talk about a potential risk rather than just a risk. So we've got here the sponsor should evaluate potential risks, which I think it's just an odd term, because a risk is a potential issue. So it's almost like it's a potential issue. I don't know. That again just seems an unnecessary change to me, having that word potential. And then those are perhaps fairly minor things. I don't know, but this I think is more important. Rather than the term error, they've changed it to the term harm or hazard. So the likelihood of a harm or hazard occurring. And I've got I can see loads of comments coming in here. I've got, I hope you're reading them, Johann. I've got a reference on harm, hazard and risk in a moment that I want to show you. I mean, before I do that, is there anything on the chat that you wanted to raise, Johann, or comment on?
Yeah, actually, Keith, I think we need to catch up with the comments, because otherwise, you know, I don't know what happens to them after, I don't know, 10 of them arrived. I think let's try to go through them. Can you also see them?
Yes.
Okay. So I can try to answer the first one. With the definition of the term trial conduct in this document includes processes from planning to reporting, including planning, initiating, performing, recording, oversight, evaluation, analysis, and reporting activities as appropriate. Does that change how early risk mitigation and management should occur? Yes, and yes, at least in my opinion. I'm a strong proponent for having a project team or a study team getting involved very, very early in the process. Actually, during the protocol development stage already, and not, after a protocol has been completed, worst case signed off, is in production, and now, we think about the risks and everything that can happen. Actually, I think it has to start much, much earlier, and therefore I think this is a good comment, that one has to start as early as possible.
And I think that quality by design is really emphasizing that so much, do it as early as possible. So I think it's almost as if RBQM has been extended into, it's bringing it earlier with the quality by design piece, is the way I'm sort of thinking of it. I mean, it's still, you could argue, a risk-based approach, but it's really focused on, I guess, what's sometimes called de-risking the protocol. It's a focus on the protocol, isn't it? There's a comment there. Yeah, when the time is right, do you think organizations such as Transcelerate will revise tools? Like they've of course got their RACT tool, or develop new tools focused on critical quality factors to help us navigate the changes? Well, I hope so. That RACT tool is what, 2015, I think it's date, and it's still, I mean, it's available for free and a lot of people use it, but I mean, the industry's moved on an awfully long way since 2015. So I certainly hope so, but I'm not sure I've seen anything from Transcelerate that they're planning to move in this area. The last they published around RBQM was on quality tolerance limits, which, of course, as it happens, looks like maybe being removed. So, but I mean, there are lots of organisations out there, of course, that potentially might do that, and I would hope so, because I think we really do need help as an industry, don't we? This could be quite confusing. I think it's good that they've tried to simplify, I think, with E6R3 draft, because they've said, no, actually critical quality factors and critical data, critical process are the same thing. We've talked about that here before, haven't we, Johann? And I don't necessarily mind how they come out, but if that's what they say, that's fine. We can work with that. But it sort of needs a definitive statement, as they seem to have.
Yeah, and actually, I know that companies, software companies, are taking everything into account what we are talking about here. So, adding, for instance, the functionality or a feature referring to critical to quality factors, so that it's being built into these systems, rather than starting from scratch and creating a brand new thing, which in my opinion is also not necessary, because critical to quality factors are a subset of what we have been talking about already for quite some time.
Yeah, and they've been around for a long time. I mean, there was CTTI, wasn't it, that came up with them 2015-ish, something like that, and then they're in E8R1, and now they're in E6R3, the draft, I keep saying. And then, so as a comment there, thank you. Yes, so the existing controls piece, as a comment that, well, actually, some, they might be done with standard of care, and you're not in control directly of standard of care. Maybe, yeah, maybe, but it just still seems an odd thing to have removed to me overall.
Yes, and actually, I think this may be even critical. I know about a company that considers removing a whole bunch of their edit checks from an EDC system. For me, that is an existing control. And the question remains, is that another threat? Is that another risk that you introduce if you remove certain existing controls and just focus on risk-based quality management with respect to your, let's say, important data and processes? So there are, I think, some aspects that still need to be discussed.
Yeah. And then the other comment is to do with, well, what I was just mentioning about this moving from error, the term error here, to harm hazard. So somebody suggested maybe they're trying to align with the Project Management Institute, PMI, risk terminology. Well, maybe they are. That's sort of what I wondered too. So thanks for that comment. But I don't think this does it terribly well. The word harm, I think, could work, but it's having the word hazard in there I think is confused. And I think that, and in fact, here's a bit of evidence for my case, and there's plenty more, but I just thought I'd pull this one because this is medical devices. This is the ISO standard, application of risk management to medical devices, and they define harm, hazard, and risk, and here they are. So harm is injury or damage to the health of people or damage to property or the environment. Hazard is a potential source of harm. You can see some examples here. And then risk is a combination of probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. So you could sort of align with this, I think, in E6R3, and why not? That would sort of make sense. That's an ISO standard. But by putting harm and hazard sort of together as if they're almost the same thing, doesn't make any sense to me, because a hazard is and a harm are different things. A hazard is a potential source of harm. So it's back to this potential sort of word again. And a risk is a definition of what that harm might be. So it's defining what the potential harm might be based on the hazard. So I'm hoping this gets changed. I just think that's it ought to align with other guidance that's out there, and otherwise I think we're going to get confused again. Yeah, thanks. There's a comment there. Hazards can be leading indicators for harm. Well, somewhat. I mean, they are, you know, things like I mean, we have these sorts of things in our trials, so they're things that can cause harm, but we need to define what those harms are and what the potential causes are, which is you know what, and that's what the risk is. So that's how we get to the risk. So interesting one. That was the one that probably, well, along with that removal of the assessing by existing controls, those two were probably the most surprising to me. And I'd say I don't know the purpose of the change. But some other changes. So do you reduce or accept the risk? This is in the risk control piece. So you've evaluated your risks now. Do you reduce them or accept them? I think it's still implied in there, really. And we've already mentioned the quality tolerance limits, or what's actually in E6R2 is predefined quality tolerance limits. Has been replaced with acceptable ranges. The sponsor should set acceptable ranges to support this process within which variation can be accepted. So it's still, and this has been trailed for some time, and we've talked about it earlier this year. People seem to be pretty convinced that QTLs were going to be removed. Of course, we still don't know that they are. Remember, this is still a draft, so let's just be a little cautious, but still, it looks as though that's probably the direction of travel. But they are still talking about measuring of risk, because they've got this idea of acceptable ranges, what's an acceptable level of risk and what's unacceptable. So I mean, that's, I think, a very positive thing. That's in some ways that's not then a massive change. It's more around definition of terms, perhaps. But the question that we had back in our RBQM mindsON episode, maybe March at the time, I think it was, we looked at this, was will it cause confusion then, removing QTLs? And in fact, I think, yes, we have another poll.
Yes, and that's the last one for today, I promise. Just a moment, please. And here we go. Which of the following most closely aligns with your perspective on the removal of QTLs from E6R3, the draft? You can select one answer, please. What is your perspective on the removal of the QTLs? Yeah, just another moment. 46 answers so far. There are still people voting. Good, then we stop here with 50 answers. Thank you very much. And I'm presenting the results now.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So A, B, and C, if we take those together, we've got a little or no impact or some impact. And so the majority are really in that camp then. Little to no impact, some impact negative, or some impact positive. We've almost 3/4 are on that. There's some there with significant impact, and there's also a group of please no more changes to QTLs. Yes, I don't know whether I might put myself in that one, to be honest. Yes, that's interesting. I mean, I suppose time will tell. Again, we don't know if QTLs will remain in the final E6R3. But I think perhaps it's largely a sort of a wording change is my overall view, and it's still really the same approach. But my concern would be that it just may cause more confusion again. And I suppose that would be my concern. Great, thank you. So let's keep going with some of the changes. So if we continue then past risk control, risk communication, review and reporting, they've removed the requirement to document RBQM from the communication section. But now all they've done is I think it's implied, because actually you've got to document everything anyway. So they're really, otherwise you'd have documentation being required in every section of GCP. So that's, I think perhaps it was a bit of an anomaly from that point of view. They're not saying don't document, and in fact the regulators are very clear on that. They've just moved this is a piece they've just moved between the sections, so I don't think that's of any real significance. Section 3.9 on sponsor oversight, which is a new section, and it's encouraging a risk-based approach, as you can see here. So they should be, decisions related to the trial should be appropriately assessed for their impact on the usual things, and risks related to such decisions should be suitably managed through planning, conducting and reporting of the trial. So in fact, all the way through, which is why we see the number of mentions of risk jump up so hugely, all the way through E6R3, it's as if risk has been, it was sort of stuck in that little piece in section 5.0, and I mean, not quite, but there was an awful lot of it there, and now it's spread right through the whole of GCP. Johann, I think you've got some more changes, haven't you?
Yep, correct. So a couple of slides on other relevant changes, and the first one is the new principle number 10. The roles and responsibilities in clinical trials should be clear and documented appropriately. I must admit that I was a little surprised about this section here, because I grew up my entire life in the industry that roles and responsibilities in clinical trials should be documented appropriately, and that the overall responsibility for RBQM remains with the sponsor. That to me is a no-brainer, because again, the responsibility for conducting clinical trials is always with the sponsor. And maybe the purpose here is to just reiterate that the sponsor is 100% aware of that. The accountability ultimately is with the sponsor company and not with a CRO or any other subcontractors. So I think I found that a little strange, I must admit, but maybe it helps to increase the overall understanding of the roles and responsibilities in the conduct of clinical trials. Another one is about the cooperation, again with CROs. This is in section 367. Any service provider used for clinical trial activities should implement appropriate quality management and report to the sponsor any incidents. I think this refers to many sponsor companies contracting with CROs and ensuring that a CRO also has an appropriate quality management system in place, as well as the sponsor company. And what I've found, again, quite interesting is that CROs must report significant incidents to the sponsor. I would have assumed, maybe incorrectly so, that the CROs had done that in the past as well, but now we got it in writing. They've got an entire section on it, and it's now 100% clear what the guideline is expecting from sponsor as well as CRO. And there is a comment, maybe it refers to this slide here. With the introduction of decentralized clinical trials and standard of care roles and responsibilities can be not under your control. I think this is about everything that can be under control. Fully understand that there are aspects in a clinical trial that are beyond anybody's control, and we all know that, for instance, the data that are being measured, like heart rate, blood pressure, everything that is being measured is probably 10 to 12% incorrect in the first place when they measure it. So we are mainly talking about all the aspects that can be kept under control, and I think that is what they refer to here as well. Okay, and another one, monitoring section completely rewritten. So that is section 311. And now it's being referred to as monitoring activities may include site monitoring performed on-site or remotely. Okay, this is now clarified what site monitoring means, and centralized monitoring depending on the monitoring strategy and the design of the clinical trial. So that is now clear what monitoring is all about, and that a company needs to describe, what their monitoring approach really is for any trial, whether run by a CRO or run with internal staff at the sponsor company.
And I do think, Johann, this is a big improvement, because I think there was quite a bit of confusion, because of course the R2 was an addendum to the 1996, the original E6, I guess R1 you might call it, and that was very much focused on this idea of monitors doing monitoring at sites, and so monitoring was sort of, it wasn't clear really. So was monitoring site monitoring, or where does centralized monitoring fit in then? And it was sort of just thrown in a bit in E6R2, I think. So this rewrite, I think, is well overdue, and I think is a really good change.
Indeed, helpful. Yeah, there was no such thing as remote monitoring in 1996, nor was there centralized monitoring. Yeah, thanks, Keith. That's really helpful. Okay, and we have another brainstorming session. Did we have one today? No, we didn't. We only have
but
polls.
5 polls. Yeah, let's change it a bit here.
Yep.
Good. This is the brainstorming session, as already said at the beginning. And here in the toolbar, when you just click on the mug with the pens, and then next on the T box, click somewhere here on the whiteboard, and then a box opens where you can start writing. Yeah, and then click OK, and it sends it directly to our whiteboard here. So let's think about what questions for RBQM do you think are helpful in the draft guidance? What is a helpful part that was listed in the draft? What is your opinion here? So, and I just sort the answers here a little bit on the whiteboard, but I think we can already start talking about it, Johann.
Yeah, actually, I see two main areas, and that is on one hand, the clarification of critical to quality factors, quality by design, critical data, critical processes, and the linkage between E6 and E8, so that it's sort of clear how these two play together. And the second one that I originally noticed, now I'm getting confused here, blurred vision. The second one is about clarification of monitoring activities, so that it's clear what kind of monitoring we are talking about, whether this is on-site, remote, or centralized monitoring. Tamara, can you open a second page? Or
Yeah, I'm sorry if I'm moving the answers up and down here. I hope that doesn't confuse you. But I have a pretty long answer that I would love to display here on the screen. Here we go. Now I've got it in full.
First sentence in sponsor responsibilities is the responsibility of the sponsor entails the implementation of risk proportionate processes to ensure the safety of the trial participants and the reliability of the trial results throughout the clinical trial life cycle. Yes, I sense that is something we already saw also in the version R2, but it's maybe now 100% clear what the expectations are. I also see elimination of QTLs. I was under the impression that with all the training that we provided so far, now ultimately everybody understood what QTLs are all about, and now the term disappears. I personally would not, remove it completely, because as Keith said, this is terminology, whether we call it QTL or we call it slightly differently, the concept, the underlying concept is certainly the same, and we should keep.
Of course, people can still call them QTLs. So I suppose, your SOP, at least in that sense, may be perfectly fine. Even though you're calling them a QTL, it still could well meet the new sort of definition of V6R3 draft, remembering it may the QTLs may still be in there for all we know. But I see there's a comment, and it's a good point, and yes, thank you for raising it. I was aware of this, that there is a draft version of the protocol template, M11, and that includes a section about QTLs. So there's I guess it's these different groups working within ICH, and it's difficult to get everything to align because I suppose they come out at different times. So it's not perfect as a process, is it?
And there's another one. Just curious if you noticed any changes that help us to reduce source data verification. No, not above and beyond what we already saw in R2. Nice try, but maybe you can submit a comment, because this is open for comment, and ask for further reductions of source data verification.
And I see there's a comment, yes, and I do agree with this. So yes, the concept QTL, the concept is the same actually, really, in the draft, but just the term QTL just doesn't really work terribly well. And we've talked about that in that session. I think it was the March one. It's just not a great term, really. And so, maybe a key risk indicator, which weirdly key risk indicators, which everybody uses, that they're not in E6R2 or the draft E6R3. But maybe they're just saying, we don't care what you call them, but we just want you to measure this stuff and have have limits and detect emerging issues and act on them, through the data, the centralized review of data.
Yep. Oh, great. This is a full page, but I think there's another one.
Yes, exactly. That brings us right to the next brainstorming part. What changes do you currently think may be challenging for RBQM in the draft guidance.
Typing challenges takes a little longer.
Or perhaps there's nothing? No.
Yeah, maybe I start already referring to the one in green. No clarification on how to set or use acceptable ranges, as the same was true for QTLs. And yes, that is absolutely true. So that is left to our discretion how we implement it, how we set and define those acceptable ranges based on, yes, medical and statistical background, but is that helpful? And the responses that I get in almost all cases is there is no access to a statistician that is going to provide us with that knowledge that we need to set up acceptable ranges or QTL. So that's certainly a difficult one. Let's start from the top, being able to identify the full study team in time for development of a protocol. Yes, yes. But I think that probably requires some, let's say, return on investment of analyses, because actually if a full study team would be available for protocol design, I think one would probably save a lot of time, a lot of hassle during the conduct of the trial and maybe towards the end of a trial, because a lot of issues could be removed during the protocol development already, rather than rolling out something that is not, I would say, compatible with the life at a site or in the clinic. Handling of thresholds, yeah, I think that goes hand in hand, if I understand that correctly, with the QTL case, the setup of the acceptable ranges, reversing formalized QTL processes that may exist. Actually, the recommendation is probably don't do that. Just keep going and put a line into your SOP saying, and when we talk about QTLs, what we mean is acceptable ranges. That may be good enough. Yeah, implementing quality by design at the initial protocol, definitely a challenge, but certainly worth the effort. Still shifting the mindset to focus on what matters, losing reference to QTLs, which everyone was getting used to now. Yes, I think we discussed that. Shifting the mindset to the focus on what matters. Yes. Agreed.
And thank you all very much for your active participation in this brainstorming section here. We are coming now to the summary. What does this all tell us?
Okay, and this is our last slide, I think. So keep in mind, this is still in consultation period. The draft, at least that is what we found out, aligns better with ICHE8, in particular for the critical to quality factors. QTLs are no longer referenced to. Risk-based approach is broadened out significantly, so more reference to risk-based or risk in general. A clarification of monitoring we got, and some couple of changes that seem to be odd, in particular to a native speaker like Keith. Evaluating risks against existing control, not explicitly mentioned. Well, that's also something that I wonder about. But this harm hazard versus the error terminology, and then the potential risk. Why potential? So those are the things that we noticed and that we just wanted to share with you. And with that, Tamara, I think we've almost reached the hour, and I pass it back to you.
Thank you all very much. That's the question and answer session that comes now. If there is a question that you want to ask Keith or Johann, just put it in the chat window now, please. And while you do so, I would like to hand over a little something to you, and that is a voucher, a loyalty voucher for your participation. We want to say thank you very much for always attending our workshops here. And this loyalty voucher will come to you in form of a coupon. So I'm going to send that to you with my email then tomorrow, where you will also receive the link to the recording. Let me check here in the chat window if we have a question coming in yet. No, nothing. Then I'll continue here and would like to invite you to our next session that takes place after a short summer break. So no webinar in August, but then we will be back on the 11th of September with the episode number 17, Developing the Critical Skill of Data Analysis. And it would be really nice to see you again in that session then on the 11th of September after a well-deserved short summer break for Johann and Keith. Good. And there is still no question. Everything was answered, I think. But if there is something, just feel free, please, to drop us an email at academy@syntegrity.com. So that was it from our side. Keith, Johann?
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And thanks. What a great interactive session.
And enjoy your vacation if you have any.
All the best to you, and
Bye.
see you again in
Bye-bye.
September then. Bye-bye.